Welcome back. So, too soon to talk about KZ? I've actually thought about it quite a while. I've been around quite a while, been through lots of corporate failures, and it really comes down to the same thing every time. It's up to you to vote with your wallet. I am certainly not going to preach morality to you and tell you what to buy and what not to buy. Not my place to do it. I mean, after all, I'm literally the guy who gets free stuff from manufacturers and stores, so I'm probably not the gatekeeper of morality. But those folks who did the work on the research and opened up their units, the guys whose names were on the boxes, that's certainly their story to tell, and I hope they continue to tell that story. But for me, I would just say vote with your wallet. Maybe after I start posting affiliate links, I will touch on that subject of reviewers and morality some other day. But for now, we'll just talk about the set as is. So this is the KZ ZES. It does have a 12 millimeter dynamic driver, and there is a magnetostat bolted to it as well. Does it work? Hopefully it does. Maybe it doesn't. Hopefully someone will open it up and figure that out. But for now, I will say what's on the box is in the shell, and hopefully it works. So shell itself is actually a bit unique because it is a sort of half metal, half resin plastic. And this is the cable that it comes with, so it's actually the upgraded 8-core. You could usually tell by this. Connector is usually the upgraded, reserved for some of the higher-end KZ sets, so it's kind of nice to see this 8-core SPC down in a $30, $35 set, or whatever it's actually selling for. So quite a nice metal shell, vent, kind of see where the seam is. And you've got some plastic inlays, which is actually kind of nice. So my biggest complaint would be this nozzle is the smaller one that KZ has used, and it's actually a pain to get tips that fit properly to it. It's just a little more trouble to get a better fit and better sound out of it. So these tips, for those of you who are Rikido, Goku, I will never ever be able to pronounce that properly. He is a big fan of radius deep mount, so these actually are radius deep mounts. And another guy whose name I cannot pronounce on KZ server also tried these out, so I sort of gave in to peer pressure and tried them out as well. So these are radius deep mounts, and they do actually help with the set in particular. So that's what the box looks like, and the easiest way to get them is to actually buy them from Amazon Japan, which is where I got mine from. So don't see those too often in reviews, so I thought I would throw those in there. So let's talk about really quickly kind of what this thing sounds like. So right off the bat, when you look at the graph of KZ EDS, which has a very standard KZ house sound, a bunch of bass, it's a little thick, a little bloated, and then a big rise for a big V shape, and then lots of kind of peaky roller coasters rounding out the treble. Very standard if you look at EDX. A lot of the other ED series and other KZ models sort of follow a similar pattern, and they might adjust this up or down a little bit, but you always see this kind of a bigger rise and then jaggy is heading down. So ZES is not your typical KZ house sound. Where does it graph close to? Probably the closest, maybe one for one, is probably the DQ6S, which is sort of ironic as this one came out right after Drivergate and DQ6S. So, but if you actually have that set and you heard the bass with this slightly elevated from KZ house sound bass, that's a little tighter, a little less bloated, it has this really nice glide, and the way it actually comes through into the mids without carrying too much energy is exactly what you hear in ZES. So maybe they borrowed it, maybe they like that level, the way it glides into the mids, but it tends to work, especially for Western music. People who like a little more bass with their music and don't like that old, bloated, sort of uncontrolled KZ sound. Even though this driver is probably not the XUN driver, it's a 12 millimeter driver, so it's obviously not, but it does have some of those little tighter, more controlled characteristics. It's not overly bloated. It's actually quite nice. I definitely think they did a good job and they picked the right level. If I had to complain about it, I would say it just needs a little less in quantity and a little more in quality. If you're really into bass details or bass texture, they really needed to bump this down slightly because it tends to mask itself. It's very fun to listen to and it's very likable, but if you listen too closely at it, it sort of edges a little towards more one note than it probably has the potential to do. So I think they would tweak it down just a hair. It would probably increase the quality by quite a bit. But as it is coming into the mids and really not all that much bleed at all into the mids, I think all that from DQ6X was the right move for this set. And then the mids themselves, a lot of what I said about DQ6S. This is another KZ set that men sound like men and women sound like women. There is a sort of natural sound to it all throughout the mids. They're kind of bumped down a little bit. Again, it's got this a little too much bass, kind of a little too much out here, and these get recessed a little bit. And so I would probably not have done that as much as it is, but that's what it sounds like. So I think the first half is very, very similar to DQ6S and not as good. I don't think it's as good as DQ6S, but I would put it in the same ballpark. And certainly the rise into the upper mids is going to be very similar. But sort of right out of the box, I will tell you what my first thought was. It's very much sounds closer to BL03, and I'll sort of walk through this again. So bass-wise, if your BL03 is a little too thick, a little too bloated, ZES actually leaned that out quite a bit. So as I said, very much leaned out like DQ6S, not as thick as BL03. So I think that was a good move. But generally, what does the bass sound like? It's a tighter, more controlled version of BL03, and just not as thick coming into the mids either. So quite nice. And then again, you get sort of this. BL03 has the most natural mids at that price range, and I think this one it's in the ballpark. They were obviously shooting for something that was closer to it, and I think they kind of almost got there. But as you rise, where BL03 had this very natural rise into 2K and carries it over, ZES dipped a bit low, and you can kind of see what they were doing. So the 8K is a bit too high. This whole bit is a bit too high, and they dropped this sort of to balance these out. And because if this part was too high, this whole thing would have been too high. It would have been a bit more traditional. So I do think they sort of ran into a snag there where they couldn't get, or maybe it was just a design decision, but this 8K is a bit too much. I have to EQ it down. So this pops up too far, and this is down a bit too low. Having the ZES a bit too low from 2 to 4 or 2 to 5 affects a lot of your clarity right here. So when I said the mids are pushed back a little bit more than BL03 and more than DQ6S, that's sort of exactly where they should have bumped this up a little bit. That would have given you more clarity, more articulation. It would have sounded like more resolution in your mids. And so that's sort of the first tuning issue that I would call out and why I wouldn't necessarily recommend ZES. I think it had a lot of potential to be up there with something that sounds like BL03, but this little bit here really hits you right here, and it's sort of the bit that I didn't really like. I think they got tonality right, but there's just not enough resolution, not enough detail in the mids, and a lot of it is happening right there. So they dipped this down a little bit, so this is a very easy listener. It's not like a typical KZ V-shape banging in your ear. It's a very slow, easy, smoother ride. But they really kind of banged on the 8K on this one as well, and they've got to figure out how to do that properly, because that would have fixed this whole imbalance right here. If they brought the 8K back down, they could have pushed that back up, and you would have a very natural sounding set. But instead you end up with something that's a little more sibilant than it should be because the 8K is a bit higher. But the rest of it, again, it's almost not a copy of BL03, but the way that ZES actually drops and extends, that was the right move, because it sort of hits you with this very polite treble. It doesn't really stick out of place. For those of you who doubt that the magnetostat is actually doing anything, on this one you can hear that wispiness to it. So I do think it does contribute something, not necessarily a good thing. It's just an odd. The whole timbre of the treble is again just it's just weird, and yet another reason why I don't necessarily recommend this one. But I do think that it's doing something, but not necessarily a good thing. But the way that drops off, the way DQ6S drops and then extends, not quite like BL03. It's just a different. You get a little more energy in different places. If people like to have air that's a little popped a little bit, so you get this part is more polite, and then they pop the edge of it out. That's one way to do it. The way BL03 does it is you sort of slowly extend and drop kind of at the same time. You end up with this nice arc that pops down, and that's exactly what ZES did, and that's why to me it reminded me exactly of BL03, the way it handles that treble. And like I said, 8K pop too much, weird wispiness to cymbals, but they were on the right track with this one. So with any luck, they will attempt this tuning again. It would probably actually be better with a single dynamic driver without the magnetostat, to be perfectly honest. The way they got most of this right, and just, if they could just poke that back in place, bring this back up to where BL03 is, they would have had something that sounded kind of amazing. But instead, it's ZES, and that's about all I have to say. Maybe I will say that the stage on the ZES is actually really good, and that was the other bit that reminded me of the BL03. It's really, really good. I mean, the height of it and the width of it, not so much the depth. The depth is kind of okay, but just the spaciousness of ZES is something that someone at KZ has figured out how to do this in budget sets, and maybe they literally did copy that from BL03, but they are definitely on the right track as far as presenting a quite amazing stage presentation. At $30, it's pretty good. Something that I've heard them evolve over the past year. This version of stage where the height, actually their first versions of height was sort of baseball cap level, where your visor hits your baseball cap. It was this kind of a lower ceiling stage, and when you hear ZES and the height of it, they've definitely evolved it, and they definitely keep on refining and working on it. So props to them for doing that. It's probably my favorite part of ZES. And I almost forgot to mention it. So there you go. So thank you again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.